Jacob Fatu returns with Jimmy Uso after bloody backstage attack on SmackDown. This is the most shocking and controversial return in WWE history. Jacob Fatu, who was supposedly paralyzed just weeks ago and facing a career-ending spinal injury, just returned to SmackDown alongside Jimmy Uso in a bloody backstage attack that has the entire wrestling world questioning whether WWE lied to us about the severity of Jacob's injuries, whether this rapid recovery is medically impossible and ruins the credibility of their storytelling, or if this return represents the most badass comeback moment that proves nothing can keep the Samoan Werewolf down. What makes this even more infuriating is that Jacob and Jimmy targeted their victims with such brutality that both men were left in pools of their own blood, raising serious questions about whether WWE has completely abandoned any pretense of rules or consequences in favor of shock value violence that crosses every line. I am absolutely torn between being hyped that Jacob is back and healthy, and being furious that WWE expects us to believe someone recovers from paralysis in 3 weeks like it's a minor inconvenience, and I'm about to break down every single detail of this bloody return, explain why Jimmy and Jacob's alliance either makes perfect sense or represents a betrayal of everything we thought we knew, reveal who they attacked and why this changes the entire SmackDown landscape, and analyze whether this return is genius booking that will create the most dominant tag team in WWE or terrible storytelling that insults the intelligence of every fan who invested emotionally in Jacob's injury. Let me describe this chaotic backstage attack because the level of violence and coordination suggests this was planned for weeks despite Jacob supposedly being hospitalized. The attack happened during a backstage segment where, let's say, Drew McIntyre and a partner or member of a rival faction were cutting a promo about their dominance and their plans to destroy what's left of the bloodline now that Jacob was gone and Roman's empire was crumbling. Suddenly, the lights in the backstage area flickered and went out completely. When they came back on seconds later, Jacob Fatu was standing right there behind the unsuspecting victims, and Jimmy Uso had emerged from another direction, trapping their targets between them with no escape route. The looks on the victims' faces went from confidence to absolute terror in an instant. Before anyone could react, Jacob and Jimmy attacked with a ferocity that shocked everyone watching. Jacob, showing zero signs of the spinal injury that supposedly left him paralyzed, moved with his trademark explosive power, delivering devastating strikes and throws that sent one victim crashing through equipment cases. Jimmy was equally vicious, wielding a steel chain he'd apparently hidden backstage, whipping it across his target's back and leaving welts that immediately started bleeding. The attack lasted maybe 90 seconds but felt like an eternity of brutality. Jacob hit his signature splash on one victim who was already down, driving all his weight onto the person's ribs. Jimmy wrapped his chain around the other victim's throat, choking them until their face turned purple before finally releasing and letting them collapse, gasping for air. Both victims were bleeding, one from the chain welts, another from hitting their head on concrete during Jacob's assault. Security finally arrived and pulled Jacob and Jimmy away, but the damage was done. Both victims were stretchered out, covered in blood, while Jacob and Jimmy stood there smiling like they'd just won the lottery. No remorse, no hesitation, just pure satisfaction at the destruction they'd caused. And as cameras focused on Jacob's face, he said just 5 words that sent chills through everyone watching: the Samoan Werewolf is back. Let me ask you right now in the comments, is Jacob Fatu's return too soon and medically impossible, ruining WWE's storytelling credibility? Or is this exactly the kind of badass comeback that makes wrestling exciting? Because the fanbase is completely divided on this. Now let's talk about the medical impossibility of Jacob's recovery, because this is where WWE either expects us to suspend disbelief to ridiculous levels or there's a twist coming that explains everything. Jacob was diagnosed with severe spinal trauma that left him paralyzed from the neck down. Doctors said it would take months of rehabilitation with no guarantee of recovery. Roman visited him in the hospital looking absolutely devastated. The emotional weight of that storyline was heavy and felt real. And then 3 weeks later, Jacob is back throwing people around like nothing happened? That's not how spinal injuries work. That's not how paralysis works. Even in the absolute best-case scenario where Jacob's paralysis was temporary due to swelling rather than permanent nerve damage, recovery would take weeks of physical therapy just to regain basic motor function, let alone the explosive athleticism required to wrestle. So WWE has put itself in a position where one of 3 things must be true. Possibility 1, Jacob was never actually paralyzed, the injury was exaggerated or completely fabricated as part of a storyline designed to make enemies think Jacob was out of commission while he secretly prepared this return with Jimmy. That would make the hospital scenes with Roman completely fake, which feels manipulative toward fans who invested emotionally. Possibility 2, Jacob recovered with miraculous speed. Maybe he had the world's best doctors, the most intensive rehabilitation, and medical science that we don't understand allowed him to recover in record time. This requires fans to just accept that wrestling operates in a universe where injuries heal much faster than reality, which WWE sometimes does but undermines dramatic weight. Possibility 3, Jacob is lying about being healed. Maybe Jacob is still significantly injured but is fighting through it, fueled by rage and adrenaline, and he'll pay the price for returning too soon in future segments. This would be the most interesting option because it adds vulnerability and consequences to his comeback. WWE needs to address this inconsistency somehow, or it damages the credibility of every future injury angle. If wrestlers can come back from paralysis in 3 weeks, why should fans ever worry when someone gets hurt? It trains the audience not to take injuries seriously because they know everyone will be fine next month regardless of how severe the damage appeared. Trivia question for the wrestling newsletter family: how long was the longest injury absence for any member of the Anoa'i family in WWE history, and who was it? Let's see who knows their Samoan wrestling dynasty history. Here's what makes me absolutely fired up about this return. Jacob Fatu and Jimmy Uso together could be the most dangerous tag team in WWE if they're actually aligned, and this isn't just a temporary alliance. Think about the combination. Jacob brings raw power, explosive athleticism, and an intimidation factor that few wrestlers can match. Jimmy brings tag team experience, ring psychology, and the credibility of being half of one of the greatest tag teams in WWE history. But the alliance itself raises massive questions. Why is Jimmy aligned with Jacob? Is this Roman's plan to rebuild the bloodline with a new structure? Is Jimmy acting independently because he feels the bloodline needs new leadership? Did Jacob and Jimmy bond during Jacob's recovery and form a brotherhood separate from Roman's influence? Or is there something more sinister? Maybe Jimmy was involved in Jacob's original attack and they've been working together all along in some elaborate scheme? The fact that WWE hasn't clearly explained their alliance yet is either brilliant mystery building or lazy storytelling, depending on how it plays out. If there's a satisfying explanation coming that ties together all the threads and makes sense in retrospect, this could be incredible. But if WWE just expects us to accept that they're partners now without proper justification, it's another example of creative not respecting the audience's intelligence. What I love about the potential of this team is that they represent a different energy than traditional bloodline. Roman's bloodline was about hierarchy, strategy, and controlled dominance. Jacob and Jimmy's partnership seems more chaotic, more violent, more willing to cross lines without hesitation. They're not politicians managing an empire, they're warriors looking to destroy anyone in their path. That could create fascinating conflict with Roman if he's still part of the story. Does Roman approve of Jacob and Jimmy's methods? Does he see them as assets or loose cannons? Does their violence reflect well on the bloodline brand, or does it make Roman's carefully constructed image look out of control? Why do you think Jimmy Uso and Jacob Fatu are aligned? Is this Roman's plan, Jimmy's independence, or something more sinister? Give me your theory in the comments. Let's discuss who Jacob and Jimmy attacked and why that choice matters for the story. The victims of this assault determine whether this return is about revenge, power, or something else entirely. If they attacked Drew McIntyre, or whoever was behind Jacob's original injury, this is straightforward revenge and the violence makes sense as payback for what was done to Jacob. If they attacked random superstars who had nothing to do with Jacob's injury, that positions Jacob and Jimmy as aggressors rather than retaliators. They're not seeking justice, they're establishing dominance through fear. That's a very different character motivation that makes them pure heels rather than sympathetic avengers. If they attacked members of the bloodline, like GUSO or Solo Sikoa, that signals internal warfare and suggests Jacob and Jimmy are breaking away to form their own faction separate from Roman. That would be the most complex option because it creates multiple layers of conflict: Jacob and Jimmy versus the bloodline versus external enemies, and questions about loyalty and family that have always defined the Anoa'i dynasty. The smartest booking choice is probably attacking the people responsible for Jacob's injury, making this a revenge story that fans can support even while being disturbed by the level of violence employed. That maintains Jacob and Jimmy's potential as complex antiheroes rather than simple villains, and it creates clear motivation that audiences understand. But WWE loves swerves and surprises, so don't be shocked if the attack victims are completely unexpected people that raise more questions than answers. That creates mystery and discussion but also risks confusing fans who just want straightforward storytelling they can follow week to week. The key is that whoever got attacked needs to be important enough that this return feels meaningful. If Jacob and Jimmy attack jobbers or low-card guys, it diminishes the impact of their comeback. But if they attacked main event talent or people with significant storyline connections, it establishes Jacob and Jimmy as immediate threats that everyone needs to take seriously. Who do you think Jacob and Jimmy attacked, and does that choice make their return heroic or villainous? Comment whether you're rooting for them or against them based on this. Here's my controversial take that's going to make people furious. Jacob Fatu returning this quickly ruins the emotional investment of his injury storyline and trains fans not to care about future injuries. Wrestling requires suspension of disbelief, but there are limits to how much you can ask audiences to ignore reality before the product becomes impossible to take seriously. When WWE devoted multiple segments to Jacob's paralysis, Roman's emotional hospital visit, the medical details about spinal cord damage, they were asking fans to invest emotionally in a tragic situation. Fans responded by genuinely caring about Jacob's well-being and feeling devastated that his career might be over. That's powerful storytelling that creates real emotional connections. But bringing Jacob back 3 weeks later completely undermines all of that investment. It tells fans none of that mattered, it was all just manipulation to create a shocking return moment. It teaches audiences to be cynical about future injury angles because they know nothing has real consequences and everyone will be fine shortly regardless of how severe the situation appears. This is the same problem WWE has with Hell in a Cell matches or tables, ladders, and chairs matches where wrestlers take brutal punishment and then wrestle normally the next week. After you see it enough times, you stop believing the violence has any real impact. You stop investing emotionally because you know it's all reset by next episode. Jacob should have been out for a minimum of 3 months to make his injury feel real and his return feel earned. They should have shown his rehabilitation process, his struggle to regain mobility, his determination to prove doctors wrong. That journey would have made his eventual return meaningful rather than just shocking. Instead, WWE chose the quick shock value return over the long-term emotionally satisfying comeback story. And while I understand the temptation, Jacob is incredible talent they want on TV immediately, they don't want the story to lose momentum at short-term thinking that damages long-term credibility. Super controversial. Would you rather Jacob stayed out 3+ months for realism, or are you glad he's back now even if it's medically impossible? This will absolutely divide the comments section. Now let's talk about the bloody violence of this return attack because WWE made a choice to have Jacob and Jimmy leave their victims bleeding and battered. In PG-era WWE, blood is relatively rare and usually saved for special moments or specific storylines. So the fact that this return featured multiple people bleeding suggests WWE wanted to make a statement about how dangerous Jacob and Jimmy are. Blood creates a visceral reaction in audiences that standard wrestling violence doesn't achieve. Seeing someone actually bleeding makes the attack feel more real, more serious, more consequential than just taking some moves and selling. It crosses a line from wrestling competition into genuine assault territory that makes fans uncomfortable in ways that can be effective for heel heat. But it also raises questions about WWE's content standards and whether they're being consistent with their family-friendly branding. WWE has spent years trying to position themselves as mainstream entertainment suitable for all ages, eliminating blood and extreme violence from their programming except in rare circumstances. Having Jacob and Jimmy cause this level of bloody carnage seems to contradict that direction unless this is WWE consciously pivoting toward edgier content. Alternatively, this could be WWE recognizing that fans have been craving more realistic, harder-hitting action that feels dangerous rather than choreographed performance art. The success of bloodier promotions like AEW has shown there's an audience that wants wrestling to feel more real and gritty. Maybe WWE is testing whether they can incorporate those elements while maintaining their broader appeal. The key is context and consequences. If Jacob and Jimmy face serious punishment for this attack, suspension, fines, legal charges and kayfabe, then the violence has meaning and creates storyline momentum. But if they just show up next week like nothing happened with no repercussions, it's just gratuitous violence for shock value without substance. Should WWE embrace more blood and violence like this return, or should they maintain PG-era standards? Comment whether you want edgier content or family-friendly wrestling. Let's address Roman Reigns' role because the tribal chief's response to Jacob's return will define whether this is bloodline business or something separate. Roman has several options. Option 1, Roman orchestrated everything: Jacob's injury, the hospital visit, the return, all part of Roman's master plan to make enemies think the bloodline was weakened when they were actually stronger than ever. This makes Roman look like a genius but also potentially manipulative toward fans. Option 2, Roman is surprised but supportive. Jacob and Jimmy acted on their own, but Roman respects their initiative and welcomes them back into the bloodline. This maintains Roman's leadership while acknowledging that family members can have agency. Option 3, Roman is angry about the unauthorized return. Jacob and Jimmy violated protocol by acting without Roman's blessing, creating conflict within the bloodline about who makes decisions and whether Roman's authority is absolute. Option 4, Roman has been replaced. Jacob and Jimmy's return signals a new bloodline with different leadership, potentially positioning Jacob as the new alpha with Jimmy as his second. Roman might be pushed out of his own family faction. Each option creates dramatically different stories. The most interesting option is probably 3 or 4 because they create internal tension rather than just everyone's happy and united against external enemies. Wrestling is best when there's conflict on multiple levels rather than simple good versus evil dynamics. My hope is that WWE doesn't just ignore Roman's role entirely and pretend this return has nothing to do with him. Roman is the bloodline in fans' minds, so his reaction needs to be addressed explicitly rather than left ambiguous because creative couldn't decide what made sense. How should Roman Reigns respond to Jacob's return? Should he be the mastermind, supportive, angry, or replaced? Vote for your preferred direction. Here's something nobody is talking about: the legal and corporate implications of Jacob and Jimmy's attack. In kayfabe, they committed aggravated assault on WWE property during a televised event, leaving multiple people injured and bleeding. That should result in immediate termination, criminal charges, and civil lawsuits from the victims. But WWE rarely explores those realistic consequences because it complicates storytelling. More likely, Jacob and Jimmy will face minimal punishment, maybe a slap on the wrist from Nick Aldis as SmackDown GM before being allowed to continue wrestling with no real repercussions. That's fine for wrestling logic, but it does create a disconnect where the violence looks serious enough to warrant real consequences but is treated as just normal wrestling business. WWE needs to decide whether they want a realistic universe with rules and authority figures who enforce them, or a chaotic universe where anything goes. The constant inconsistency is what frustrates fans more than either choice would individually. Here's my final analysis before I need your thoughts. Jacob Fatu returning with Jimmy Uso in a bloody attack is either WWE's most badass comeback moment that establishes a terrifying new force on SmackDown, or it's terrible storytelling that ruins injury credibility and asks fans to ignore medical reality. Both perspectives are valid depending on what you value in wrestling: shocking moments versus long-term consistency. The execution of this return was undeniably effective at creating buzz and making people talk. The violence was shocking, Jacob looked like a beast, Jimmy showed a vicious side we don't always see, and the mystery about their alliance creates intrigue. If WWE follows through with proper explanations and consequences, this could be remembered as an iconic return. But if WWE just moves forward without addressing the medical impossibility of Jacob's recovery, the victims of the attack are never mentioned again, and Jacob/Jimmy's alliance is never properly explained, this becomes another example of WWE expecting fans to just accept whatever happens without logical consistency or storytelling coherence. The wrestling world is watching to see which version we get. Is this the start of something special or just another shock moment that leads nowhere? If you made it through this entire breakdown, you're legendary. Do 3 things. First, smash the like button if you're hyped Jacob's back but confused about the medical timeline. Second, leave detailed comments answering all questions too soon. Medical possibility? Alliance explanation? Roman's role? Violence level appropriate? Third, subscribe and hit that bell because this story is just beginning and I'm covering every twist as Jacob and Jimmy's rampage continues. This is either brilliant or terrible and we need to figure out which together.